Victoria's invitation to the most exclusive private art auction in Manhattan arrived with a single, breathtaking condition. You are welcome to attend, provided you do not tell anyone you are my sister. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, letting the sheer audacity of her words settle into my bones. She was marrying into a judicial dynasty. Her fiancé's father was a federal judge, and a sibling like me was a smudge on her meticulously curated canvas. She didn't want any embarrassing distractions ruining her formal introduction to New York's elite. To Victoria, it was a practical social calculation, devoid of malice. To me, it was the final, icy confirmation of a truth I had swallowed my entire life. In the grand exhibition of our family, she was the masterpiece meant to be showcased. I was the ugly preliminary sketch, better left buried in the archives. Oh, the exquisite, suffocating irony of it all. Victoria had spent her life cultivating the brilliant, sterile reputation of a celebrated commercial lawyer, desperate to belong in the very rooms she was now banning me from. But while she worshipped blindly at the altar of high society, I dismantled it. As a senior investigator for Interpol's art crime unit, I spent my days tracking the filthy, blood-stained trails left behind when priceless cultural artifacts vanished into the vaults of the ultra-rich. My work never made the glossy pages of her socialite magazines, but it moved like a ghost through the exact same world of galleries, elite collectors, and private auctions that Victoria revered. When she looked at these people, she saw pedigree and influence. When I looked at them, I saw suspects. The gallery was a temple of hushed arrogance on the Upper East Side, all elegant white stone and towering glass doors that locked out the ordinary world. I arrived exactly on time that Friday evening, stepping into a curated illusion bathed in soft lighting and the clinking of crystal. It wasn't just an auction, it was a coronation, a social ceremony designed to launder immense wealth through the guise of culture. I had almost declined her insulting summons, but earlier that week, a flicker of professional intuition had driven me to run the gallery's name through our secure database. It was a minor blip in a classified financial intelligence report, a fleeting connection to an international trafficking syndicate operating between Geneva and New York. It was far from concrete proof, just a shadow. But in my world, shadows always preceded the monsters. I spotted my sister instantly. Victoria was holding court near the center of the room, a vision of practiced elegance, her posture as flawless and rigid as marble. When her eyes caught mine, her radiant, calculated smile fractured for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. She excused herself and glided toward me, enveloping me in a suffocating, perfume-heavy embrace that contained absolutely zero warmth. "Remember what we agreed upon," she hissed against my cheek, her voice a velvet threat meant only for me. "Enjoy the champagne, but you are just a guest tonight. Don't ruin this." I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I simply offered a blank, obedient nod. After a lifetime of being erased, I knew better than to fight her on her stage. Let her have her perfect night. I retreated to the far side of the gallery, playing the perfectly insignificant wallflower she demanded. I drifted along the periphery for a while, letting the self-important chatter wash over me, pretending to be dazzled by the art like the rest of the oblivious sheep. And then, my gaze snagged on a canvas isolated on the center wall. It was a tranquil European landscape, a serpentine river cutting through a verdant valley beneath a bruised, pale sky. The brushwork was late 19th century, soft and melancholic. But it wasn't the masterful technique that paralyzed my lungs. It was a visceral, electric jolt of recognition. I stepped closer, my pulse suddenly roaring in my ears, drowning out the string quartet. I traced the curve of the riverbank with my eyes, noting the specific, deliberate grouping of the willow trees. The longer I stared, the more the polite hum of the gallery faded into absolute silence. I knew this painting. And more importantly, I knew exactly whose blood had been spilled to take it. I froze. The mindless chatter of the gallery faded into a dull, aquatic hum as my brain cross-referenced thousands of crime scene photos. To the untrained eye, the wealthy sheep grazing around me, it was merely a serene pastoral landscape, perfectly sized to hang above a Hamptons fireplace. But to me, the serpentine river, the distinctive cluster of weeping willows listing to the left, and that bruised, hazy ridgeline screamed a different story. I knew this composition intimately, and the last time I saw it, it wasn't bathed in the warm glow of gallery spotlights. It was crime scene evidence. 3 years ago, thieves gutted a provincial museum outside Florence during a chaotic renovation. The world press barely blinked. These weren't Da Vinci's, but my unit paid attention. This specific 19th century landscape had been criminally undervalued by historians, making it the holy grail for the black market. Undervalued art is the perfect illicit currency. Easy to steal, effortless to smuggle across borders, and incredibly lucrative when quietly fenced to the right, morally bankrupt billionaire. This wasn't just a stolen painting, it was a ghost. And now, it was haunting my sister's party. I drifted closer, stopping inches from the gilded frame, my eyes raking over the cracked varnish. Every stolen masterpiece carries a scar, a microscopic fingerprint invisible to the arrogant collectors who only see dollar signs. I didn't care about the masterful brushstrokes, I was hunting for a flaw. I dropped my gaze to the lower right quadrant, right where the painted river vanished into the shadows. The Interpol dossier had been explicit. Decades ago, the canvas had suffered a hairline fracture in that exact spot. A clumsy Florentine conservator had patched it, leaving a microscopic ridge of darker pigment, a scar that would only reveal itself under direct, punishing light. I shifted my weight, letting the gallery's obscenely expensive halogen bulbs catch the oil surface at an angle. There, a faint, jagged shadow interrupting the smooth flow of the river, the restoration scar. A cold, predatory thrill spiked through my veins, sharp and intoxicating. This wasn't a clever forgery. This was the Florentine ghost, which meant this impeccably curated high society auction was nothing more than a brazen fencing operation. They were about to sell a piece of international evidence. I stepped back, letting the mask of a bored socialite slip back over my face, and surveyed the room. The string quartet played on. Waiters circulated with vintage champagne. The elite guests murmured in admiring tones, utterly blind to the felony hanging on the wall. This is how the underworld washes its hands, burying stolen goods under avalanches of forged provenance papers, sophisticated lighting, and black tie elegance. Across the sea of tailored suits, I spotted Victoria. She threw her head back, laughing melodically at a joke made by her future father-in-law, the federal judge. She was radiating triumph, finally breathing the rarefied air she had starved herself for. The perfect dress, the perfect fiancé, the perfect evening. She had meticulously built her entire social empire on a foundation of absolute, fragile illusion. I smiled. A dark, genuine smile. How violently would her pristine world shatter if I walked over and arrested the gallery owner right now? But revenge, like a good investigation, requires patience. I turned away and sauntered toward a sleek digital catalog terminal. I scrolled past the overpriced modern garbage until the Florentine ghost appeared on the screen. The provenance read like a bad joke. Sourced from a distinguished private European collection via a confidential intermediary. Translation: smuggled through a shell company. Worse, the estimated starting bid was suspiciously low, an insulting bargain. That pathetic price tag confirmed everything. Traffickers intentionally lowball stolen masterpieces to ignite a rapid, blind bidding war. A fast, chaotic sale minimizes the window for genuine experts to ask uncomfortable questions about its history. Once the auctioneer's hammer falls in a legitimate Manhattan gallery, the painting is instantly washed clean, transformed back into a legal asset. I palmed my phone, silently snapping high-resolution photos of the digital screen. 2 anonymous paddles were already pre-registered for this specific lot. I recognized the alphanumeric formatting of their proxy IDs. They were routed through untraceable Cayman Island trusts, a classic hallmark of a prearranged money laundering strike. This wasn't an open auction. It was a perfectly choreographed criminal transaction. I glanced back at the canvas. A man in a sharp, charcoal gray suit had taken my place. He wasn't staring at the art. His eyes were hard, systematically scanning the reflections in the gallery glass, tracking the crowd. He wasn't a buyer. He was a watchdog, making sure the asset stayed safe until the hammer dropped. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Victoria wanted me to sit quietly in the shadows so I wouldn't ruin her perfect night. But her perfect night was a crime scene, and I held the match that could burn it all down. For a few minutes, I stayed near the painting without drawing attention to myself, letting other guests step forward to admire it while I watched quietly from the side. Years of investigative work had taught me that the most dangerous moment in a case like this was the one where instinct rushed ahead of proof. Recognizing a painting from memory was not enough. If I was going to act, I needed something stronger than suspicion. I needed confirmation that could stand up under legal scrutiny once the situation became public. The gallery lights above the canvas shifted slightly as someone adjusted the display for the evening auction. The movement caused a thin reflection to pass across the surface of the painting, briefly revealing the subtle texture of the old varnish beneath. That was when the restoration line near the lower edge appeared again, just visible enough to confirm what I had already suspected. The line curved gently through the paint layer in exactly the same position recorded in the museum's restoration file from Florence. I had studied that image months earlier during a case briefing. Seeing it now beneath the warm gallery lights felt like recognizing a familiar scar on a stranger's face. I stepped back and looked around the room again. The atmosphere remained relaxed and elegant. Waiters continued offering champagne to guests while quiet conversations floated across the hall about investment portfolios, museum donations, and upcoming exhibitions. No one appeared to notice anything unusual about the painting that might soon become the most important object in the room for a completely different reason. Across the gallery, Victoria moved effortlessly through the crowd, introducing her fiancé to several influential guests. I could see the pride in her posture as she guided him from one conversation to the next. Tonight was meant to be an important step for her, the moment when the powerful family she was marrying into would finally see her as part of their world. She had always believed success came from controlling how people perceived you. Standing there beneath the soft lights of the gallery, she looked like someone who believed everything was unfolding perfectly. I wondered briefly how fragile that image might be if the truth behind the painting became public. Instead of approaching the canvas again, I walked slowly toward the digital catalog terminal near the center of the room. Guests were using the screen to review the artworks scheduled for the auction, casually discussing which pieces might attract the highest bids later in the evening. I waited until the terminal was free before touching the display. The catalog opened with a polished list of paintings, accompanied by short descriptions and estimated values. When I scrolled to the landscape painting, the information on the screen confirmed the same vague provenance printed in the physical brochures earlier. The work had supposedly come from a private European collection through a reputable intermediary dealer. The description sounded carefully written to avoid specific details about the painting's past ownership. That kind of language often appeared in cases where the full history of an artwork could not be easily verified. What caught my attention even more was the list of registered bidders connected to the piece. Most of the collectors attending the auction had registered under their real names, something common in prestigious events where reputation mattered as much as wealth. But 2 entries connected to the landscape painting were marked only with anonymous registration numbers. When I tapped the information icon beside them, the system displayed financial entities registered through offshore accounts. That detail alone did not prove anything illegal. Many wealthy collectors preferred anonymity during high-value auctions. But combined with the suspicious provenance and the restoration mark I had just seen on the canvas, the pattern felt increasingly familiar. I quietly photographed the catalog entry with my phone and sent the image through a secure messaging application to a colleague working with our financial intelligence unit. The message itself was brief. I included the name of the gallery, the bidder registration numbers, and the estimated price listed for the painting. If those numbers matched any of the offshore entities we had already been tracking in our investigation, I would know within minutes. As I slipped the phone back into my purse, a man in a gray suit approached the painting again. I recognized him immediately as the same person who had been studying the canvas earlier. This time, he did not pretend to admire the brushwork at all. Instead, his eyes moved carefully across the room, stopping briefly on each guest standing nearby. For a moment, our eyes met across the gallery. His expression remained neutral, but something in the way he looked at me suggested he was measuring the same question that had been forming in my mind. Was someone else here also watching the painting for a reason that had nothing to do with art? The quiet vibration of my phone answered that question before I could think further. My colleague had already responded, and the message contained exactly the confirmation I had been afraid of. The message from my colleague was short, but it carried enough information to turn a suspicion into something far more serious. One of the anonymous bidder accounts registered for the painting belonged to an offshore investment entity that had appeared repeatedly in financial intelligence reports connected to art trafficking investigations. The account itself was not illegal. Wealthy collectors often used complex financial structures to purchase art privately. But this particular fund had surfaced in at least 3 separate cases involving stolen cultural property that investigators believed had been quietly laundered through high-end auctions. I slipped the phone back into my purse and forced myself to remain calm. Acting too quickly would draw attention, and attention was the last thing I wanted until I understood exactly what was happening. Around me, the gallery continued functioning exactly as it had since the evening began. Guests laughed, glasses touched softly in quiet toasts, and the soft murmur of expensive conversations drifted through the room like background music. No one seemed aware that the painting on the wall might be the center of an international criminal operation. Across the gallery, the man in the gray suit had moved closer to the painting again. This time, he stood slightly off to the side rather than directly in front of it, watching the guests who passed nearby. His behavior confirmed the uneasy feeling I had earlier. He wasn't studying the artwork as a collector would. He was studying the room itself. I decided to observe him more carefully without making it obvious. From where I stood near the catalog terminal, I could see his reflection faintly in the glass covering another painting on the opposite wall. Every few seconds, his eyes moved toward the digital display listing the auction order for the evening. The landscape painting was scheduled to appear midway through the sale. That meant there was still time before the bidding began. Time enough for me to verify one more detail. I walked casually back toward the painting, blending with a small group of guests discussing several pieces displayed nearby. When the space in front of the canvas cleared for a moment, I stepped close enough to examine the lower corner again. The thin restoration line was still visible beneath the lights. I raised my phone as if checking a message, angling the camera slightly so the corner of the canvas appeared in the frame. The photograph captured the exact mark I was looking for. I opened the secure application on my phone and attached the image to a message addressed to the federal liaison assigned to our task force in the United States. My note was brief. I described the restoration mark and included the catalog information I had photographed earlier. If the painting truly matched the stolen landscape from Florence, the federal authorities would need to act quickly before the auction concluded. The message sent successfully, and I lowered the phone again. At that exact moment, the gallery director's voice rose above the quiet conversations in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please begin moving toward the main hall, we will be starting the auction shortly." Guests gradually began drifting toward the larger room at the center of the gallery where rows of chairs had been arranged facing a raised platform. Assistants carefully repositioned several paintings near the stage so they could be presented during the sale. The landscape painting was lifted from the wall and placed on a freestanding easel beneath a brighter spotlight. Seeing it positioned there created a strange feeling in my chest. It no longer looked like just another painting. It looked like evidence waiting to be claimed. I followed the crowd into the main hall and chose a seat near the back, where I could watch both the stage and the entrance doors. Victoria and her fiancé took places near the front beside his parents and several other guests who clearly belonged to the same powerful social circle. Even from across the room, I could see the excitement in her expression. The auction was the highlight of the evening she had spent months planning. The auctioneer stepped onto the platform and greeted the audience with polished confidence. His voice carried smoothly across the room as he explained the order of the artworks and thanked the guests for attending such a prestigious event. Applause followed politely, and the first painting was presented. The early sales moved quickly. Collectors raised paddles, the auctioneer repeated each offer with theatrical rhythm, and assistants recorded the winning bids while removing sold paintings from the display. The atmosphere grew livelier with every successful sale. Laughter and quiet applause filled the hall whenever a piece sold above its estimated value. All the while, I kept one eye on my phone. Nearly 15 minutes passed before it vibrated again in my hand. The reply from the federal liaison appeared on the screen. The photograph I sent matched the restoration record from the Florence Museum with near-perfect certainty. If the painting on the stage was authentic, it was the same one reported stolen 3 years earlier. And the message ended with a final sentence that made the room suddenly feel much smaller. Federal agents were already on their way to the gallery. The auction continued with confident rhythm as the early paintings were sold one after another, each hammer strike echoing softly across the hall. From the back row, I watched the process carefully, but my attention was no longer on the artwork. The message from the federal liaison remained clear in my mind. Agents were already moving toward the gallery, which meant everything now depended on timing. If the stolen paintings sold before they arrived, the laundering process would become far more complicated to challenge legally. The auctioneer presented the next piece with polished enthusiasm, while assistants adjusted the lighting around the stage. Collectors lifted their paddles calmly, the bids rising in steady increments that reflected both wealth and practiced confidence. Around me, guests leaned forward with interest, whispering predictions about which paintings would exceed their estimates. To them, it was simply a fascinating evening of art and investment. To me, it felt like watching a clock quietly counting down. I glanced toward the entrance doors several times, but no one had arrived yet. The federal liaison had not sent another message either. I knew better than to expect updates every minute. Operations like this moved carefully, especially when agents needed to enter a private event without creating unnecessary panic. Across the hall, Victoria sat proudly beside her fiancé, her attention fixed entirely on the auctioneer. Every successful sale seemed to strengthen the energy of the room, and she responded to the rising bids with small smiles of satisfaction. The evening had become exactly the kind of elegant spectacle she had envisioned when she helped organize the event. She had no reason to suspect that the most important moment of the auction would soon unfold very differently. The auctioneer announced the next item, and assistants carefully positioned a painting on the easel behind him. A brief description followed, along with a starting price that immediately drew several bidders into the competition. The numbers climbed steadily while the audience watched with polite excitement. When the hammer finally struck, applause filled the room again. Then the auctioneer turned slightly and gestured toward the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "our next piece is a remarkable landscape from a private European collection." 2 assistants carried the painting forward and placed it on the central easel beneath the spotlight. The river valley appeared exactly as I remembered it. Even from the back of the hall, the restoration line near the lower corner caught the light faintly, confirming once again that the painting was the same one stolen from Florence. The room grew noticeably quieter as guests leaned forward to study the canvas. Several collectors lifted their bidding paddles even before the auctioneer finished describing the piece. The opening bid was announced. Immediately, 3 paddles rose. The auctioneer repeated the price with theatrical clarity while assistants recorded the offers. Within seconds, the numbers began climbing faster than any painting sold earlier that evening. One bidder dropped out quickly, leaving 2 remaining competitors pushing the price higher with deliberate confidence. I turned slightly toward the digital screen displaying the bidder registrations. Both numbers matched the anonymous accounts I had seen earlier in the catalog. The offshore entities. The bidding accelerated. The auctioneer's voice grew more energetic as each new offer was announced. Guests whispered excitedly around the hall, while several collectors who had not intended to bid watched the competition with fascination. It was the kind of dramatic moment that auction houses loved to see, but I knew exactly what it meant. Someone inside the trafficking network was trying to finalize the sale as quickly as possible. My phone vibrated softly again. I lowered my gaze to the screen without attracting attention. The federal liaison had sent a single sentence. Agents had arrived outside the gallery and were moving into position. I looked back toward the stage. The price had already doubled from the original estimate. The auctioneer raised his hand again as another bid was placed from the anonymous account. The room buzzed with excitement as the competition continued between the two hidden buyers. Each offer came within seconds of the previous one, pushing the value higher and higher. The man in the gray suit sat 2 rows ahead of me, watching the screen with intense concentration. He did not raise a paddle, but every time the anonymous bidder number increased, his expression tightened slightly. The pattern confirmed what I had already suspected. He wasn't a collector. He was waiting to see whether the transaction succeeded. The auctioneer announced another bid and glanced across the room. "Do I hear a higher offer?" For a brief moment, no one responded. The hammer lifted slightly in his hand. If it struck now, the painting would officially be sold. My phone vibrated once more. This time the message contained only 2 words. "They're inside." At that exact moment, the heavy doors at the back of the hall opened. The doors at the back of the hall opened with a quiet but unmistakable sound that cut through the tension of the moment. Several people in the last rows turned instinctively toward the entrance, their attention shifting away from the stage just as the auctioneer raised his hammer again. At first, the guests seemed only mildly curious, assuming another group of late arrivals had come to watch the bidding. But when the first federal agent stepped into the room and lifted his badge beneath the lights, the entire atmosphere changed instantly. The auctioneer froze mid-sentence. His hand remained suspended above the podium while the agent walked calmly down the center aisle toward the stage. 2 more officers followed a few steps behind him, moving with quiet precision along the edges of the hall. The murmurs among the audience spread quickly as people realized something serious was unfolding. Conversations stopped completely, replaced by a tense silence that filled the room like a sudden drop in temperature. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead agent said in a steady voice once he reached the front of the stage, "this auction needs to be paused while we verify the provenance of the painting currently on display." The words traveled through the crowd like a shockwave. For several seconds, no one moved. The auctioneer slowly lowered the hammer onto the podium without striking it, his expression shifting from polished confidence to stunned confusion. The gallery director hurried toward the stage, clearly struggling to understand what was happening. From the front row, Victoria leaned forward in her seat, whispering something urgently to her fiancé while staring at the agents now standing beside the painting. The spotlight above the canvas continued illuminating the peaceful river valley, completely unchanged by the tension surrounding it. The lead agent turned slightly toward the gallery director and displayed official identification. His tone remained calm but firm as he explained that the artwork matched the description of a painting stolen from a museum in Florence 3 years earlier. Because of that connection, the painting was now being treated as potential evidence in an ongoing international investigation. Gasps and whispers spread across the hall. Some guests turned in their seats to look at one another, while others instinctively reached for their phones. The elegant atmosphere that had defined the evening only minutes earlier had vanished completely. In its place stood the controlled seriousness of a federal operation unfolding in real time. 2 additional officers approached the easel and began examining the painting carefully. One of them used a small camera to photograph the frame and the surface of the canvas, while the other inspected the back of the painting for identifying marks. Their movements were methodical and professional, the practiced routine of investigators collecting evidence. The gallery director tried to maintain composure while explaining that the painting had arrived with documentation confirming its private European ownership. His voice carried across the room, but the confidence in his tone had clearly weakened. The lead agent listened patiently before responding that forged provenance documents were a common method used by art trafficking networks to move stolen works into legitimate markets. Several guests stood quietly and began moving toward the exits, unsure whether they should remain or leave the increasingly uncomfortable scene. Others stayed seated, captivated by the dramatic turn the evening had taken. A few people in the back rows whispered excitedly as if they were watching the climax of a documentary rather than experiencing it firsthand. Victoria slowly rose from her chair near the front row. Her expression had changed completely from the confident smile she carried earlier in the evening. She looked toward the stage, then toward the agents moving around the painting, clearly struggling to understand how the elegant event she had organized could collapse so suddenly. Her fiancé tried to speak with one of the officers, but another agent politely asked him to remain seated while the investigation proceeded. Nearby, the man in the gray suit shifted uneasily in his chair. One of the agents reviewing the digital bidder records spoke quietly to a colleague and then walked toward him. The officer asked for his identification in a calm voice that carried just enough authority to silence the surrounding conversations. The man hesitated before reaching into his jacket pocket. Across the hall, the auctioneer had stepped completely away from the podium, his role in the evening effectively finished. The painting was gently removed from the easel and placed onto a padded transport board prepared by the evidence team. The once celebrated centerpiece of the auction was now being handled like a fragile artifact recovered from a crime scene. From my seat near the back, I watched everything unfold with quiet clarity. The hammer had never fallen. The transaction that would have legitimized the stolen artwork had been stopped seconds before it became official. Around the hall, the guests continued whispering in disbelief as federal agents carefully prepared the painting for removal. For them, the evening had transformed into a shocking story they would talk about for years. For me, it was something else entirely. It was the moment when a quiet investigation finally stepped into the light. The silence in the hall lasted only a few seconds before the quiet order of the evening completely dissolved into a wave of confused whispers. Guests leaned toward one another, asking hurried questions about the agents and the painting that had just been removed from the easel. The elegant rhythm of the auction had vanished, replaced by the uneasy awareness that something far more serious had just happened in front of them. The lead federal agent remained near the platform while his team continued documenting the artwork and securing the surrounding area. Two officers stood beside the transport board where the landscape painting now rested, carefully adjusting protective padding around the frame. Another agent photographed the back of the canvas, focusing on the small inventory markings that museums often stamp discreetly along the wooden stretcher. Every movement was precise and methodical. The professionalism of the process only made the tension in the room more noticeable. The gallery director stood nearby, speaking with the lead agent in a voice that tried to remain calm but carried a clear edge of anxiety. He repeated that the painting had arrived through a respected intermediary dealer and that all documentation had been verified before the auction. The agent listened patiently, then explained that investigators had already traced financial connections between the auction's anonymous bidder accounts and offshore entities associated with art trafficking operations. The explanation caused another ripple of murmurs among the remaining guests. Several collectors who had been watching the bidding earlier exchanged uneasy glances. The excitement they had shown during the auction was gone now, replaced by the cautious expressions of people realizing they had almost participated in something illegal without knowing it. Some guests quietly gathered their coats and began leaving the hall, choosing distance over curiosity. Victoria still stood near the front row beside her fiancé. The confidence she had displayed earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. Her eyes moved repeatedly between the agents and the empty space on the stage where the painting had stood only minutes earlier. The scandal unfolding around her was clearly not the kind of attention she had expected for the event she had helped organize. Her fiancé's father remained seated, watching the investigation with quiet focus. As a federal judge, he seemed less surprised than most of the guests. Years of legal experience had likely taught him that cases involving financial crimes often appeared in places where people least expected them. Meanwhile, one of the agents stepped away from the digital registration system and approached the man in the gray suit who had been sitting 2 rows ahead of me earlier. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions regarding the bidder account associated with your registration," the agent said calmly. The man stiffened slightly before standing. His earlier composure had vanished, replaced by the tense expression of someone realizing that the situation had shifted beyond his control. He handed over his identification, while another officer quietly confirmed the bidder account number on the digital screen. The surrounding guests watched with silent curiosity as the agent spoke with him in low voices. Though the conversation was brief, it was clear that the investigators had already connected the account to the offshore investment entity mentioned earlier. Across the room, Victoria noticed the exchange and turned sharply toward the back rows. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Her expression held confusion, suspicion, and something else I had seen many times during our lives together. The uncomfortable realization that a situation she thought she understood was suddenly far more complicated than she had imagined. She opened her mouth as if considering whether to approach me, then hesitated when one of the agents stepped between the rows to escort the man in the gray suit toward the exit. The investigation was clearly expanding beyond the painting itself. Near the stage, the lead agent addressed the remaining guests once more. He explained that the artwork would be taken into federal custody while specialists confirmed its identity, and that financial records connected to the auction were now part of an ongoing investigation into international art trafficking. The room responded with a mixture of stunned silence and quiet conversation. What had begun as an elegant cultural event had transformed into a public exposure of a criminal network that had nearly succeeded in laundering a stolen masterpiece through a prestigious auction. The agents carefully lifted the protected painting and carried it toward the exit where additional officers waited outside. The once admired landscape, glowing peacefully beneath the lights earlier in the evening, now disappeared through the doors surrounded by evidence handlers and federal investigators. From my seat near the back of the hall, I watched the final moment quietly. The auction had ended, but the real story behind the painting was only beginning to unfold. The gallery felt strangely quiet after the agents carried the painting out through the main doors. What had been a crowded, vibrant hall only an hour earlier now looked like the aftermath of a storm that had passed too quickly for anyone to understand. Several guests had already left, while others lingered near the walls, speaking in hushed voices about what they had just witnessed. The elegant music that had played softly throughout the evening had stopped completely, leaving only the distant echo of footsteps and the quiet murmur of conversations fading toward the exit. Near the front of the room, the gallery director continued speaking with 2 federal agents, answering questions about the dealer who had consigned the painting and the financial details connected to the auction. Their voices remained calm and professional, but the weight of the situation was obvious. What had been presented as a prestigious artwork from a private collection was now being treated as evidence connected to an international smuggling investigation. Victoria stood a few steps away from them, her arms folded as she watched the conversation unfold. The confident energy she had carried earlier in the evening was completely gone. For the first time since I arrived, she looked unsure of where she belonged in the room. The event she had helped organize to impress her fiancé's powerful family had instead become the center of a federal investigation. Her fiancé spoke quietly with his parents near the exit, their expressions serious but controlled. The federal judge who had drawn so much attention earlier remained composed as he listened to one of the agents explaining the situation in greater detail. Whatever conclusions he was reaching about the evening, he kept them to himself. I remained near the back of the hall for a few minutes longer, watching the final pieces of the scene settle into silence. Investigations like this rarely ended with dramatic speeches or visible triumph. Most of the time, they concluded with paperwork, careful documentation, and the slow process of tracing financial records across different countries. Yet even without ceremony, there was a quiet sense of closure in knowing that the painting would soon return to the museum that had lost it. Eventually, I stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles reflected softly across the windows of the gallery, while a small group of agents continued coordinating the transport of the recovered artwork. A few guests still stood on the sidewalk discussing the unexpected events of the evening, their voices carrying fragments of disbelief and fascination. What they had witnessed would likely become one of those strange stories people repeated for years. Across the street, Victoria emerged from the building with her fiancé beside her. She paused when she noticed me standing near the curb. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to say something, but whatever words came to her seemed to fade before they reached her lips. The silence between us was not hostile. It was simply the quiet distance that had always existed between two sisters who had chosen very different lives. After a few seconds, she turned away and followed her fiancé toward a waiting car. The street gradually returned to its normal rhythm as traffic moved through the intersection, and the last guests disappeared into the city. Above the rooftops, the lights of Manhattan stretched into the distance, glowing against the dark sky like thousands of quiet signals. Somewhere far across the ocean, the museum in Florence would soon receive confirmation that the stolen landscape painting had finally been found. For the investigators who had spent years tracing the hidden path of that artwork, tonight was only one step in a much longer process, but it was the step that mattered most. The moment when truth finally surfaced in a room where no one had expected to see it. And sometimes that is how justice works. Not with loud declarations or dramatic victories, but with quiet patience, careful observation, and the willingness to notice details others overlook. If you had been in that gallery tonight, watching the auction stop just seconds before the hammer fell, what do you think would have surprised you the most? Would you have sensed that something was wrong before the agents entered the room, or would the truth have caught you completely off guard? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments and tell me what moment in this story stayed with you the longest. And if you enjoy stories about hidden truths, quiet investigations, and the moments when justice finally appears where no one expects it, stay here with the channel and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story waiting to unfold. Thank you for being part of this journey and for listening all the way to the end. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.